What's up, people? Welcome back to 4Bet Blind. My name is Will. Today I'm bringing you a very special episode of the vlog as I'm recapping what might be the greatest session of my poker career. I'm talking flushes, boats, sets, crazy multi-way bluffs for huge sizing, and a final hand that I still cannot believe. Without further ado, let's jump in. Today I'm playing 1-2 at Full House Poker in Eugene, Oregon. I buy in for the max of 300 and get a very warm welcome to the table when I look down at Ace-King in the big blind. There's an open to 10 in the low jack before the cutoff and small blind both make the call. I'm loving it. This is a great spot to 3-bet, so I bump it up to 65. The original raiser and the cutoff both make the fold before the small blind goes into the tank. After a few moments of deliberation, he eventually announces one time and flicks in the call. Asking the poker gods for divine intervention is obviously a sign of strength. I keep that in mind as we go to a flop that comes 3-3-10 rainbow. The small blind checks, and given the strength he's shown, I decide I'm going to turn this hand into a bluff if it comes to that. So I start off with a c-bet of 25. I'm getting my chips ready to jam the turn once he makes this call, but it doesn't come to that as he makes the fold. Call me Marvel Studios, cause it's time for an unnecessary sequel. I've got Ace-King once more and open to 15 after an early position limp. The cutoff calls before the player in the big blind gets a mischievous look on his face and 3-bets up to 70. I've got a little bit of a read on this opponent. One hand in particular stands out where I saw him open King Deuce offsuit on the button. I guess he's a really big fan of this scene in The Dark Knight. I don't know. Given his proclivity for creative pre-flop play, there's not much to do here but jam all in. The cutoff folds, and folks, you are in for a treat as we get a world-class performance of how do I make my 3-bet look less full of shit. We get the chip counting, the chip recounting, the pot counting. Just a legendary performance by my opponent, and can we just take a moment, Eventually, my opponent does make the fold, and I take down another pot with Ace-King. Feeling pretty good at this point in the session, but I had no idea the heater I was about to go on. It starts off when I look down at King-9 of spades on the button. There's an early position limp, followed by a raise to 12 by the cutoff. Normally, I would lean towards a fold with this hand when you factor in rake, but during this session, the room's bad beat jackpot that normally hovers around aces full had dropped all the way down to queens full of eights. I think that gives us license to play a bit looser, especially in position, so I make the call. It looks like I may not get an opportunity to hit the jackpot though when the small blind comes in for a 3-bet, but only to $30. The cutoff makes the call, and this is just too good a price to fold to, so I call as well. Off to the flop 3-handed, and it's a good one. It is Queen 6-4 with 2 spades. The small blind continues for 30, the cutoff calls, and I decide to call as well. So still 3-handed and off to the turn, and boy is it a good one, it is the ace of spades. I've got the nut flush, and I haven't been this excited since my barista accidentally touched my hand while giving me my coffee. To top it all off, the small blind continues betting, this time for 20, before the cutoff decides to raise to 45. It seems like the small blind can never have good cards when he picks this small a size, so I'm really focused on the cutoff. He only has about 167 left, and considering the fact that he put in a raise versus 3 players, it's hard to imagine he's going to be folding. So I go ahead and rip it in here, hoping to get called by 2 pair, worse flushes, maybe some sets. Unfortunately, we do not get the snap call, and instead my opponent goes well into the tank. Is this guy thinking of folding a flush here? Perhaps I got way too ambitious with this raise and should have just slow played in position. Eventually, we get that magical sight of my opponent's chips sailing into the middle, so off to the river, hoping for something clean. It's the 7 of spades, so glad I got it in on the turn before the action could freeze on the river. I table my hand, and I'm getting ready to console my opponent. I mean, how are you supposed to fold a flush or a set there? Just bad luck, and oh, is that Ace-King? No spade? This is the moment I knew this game was going to be more lit than John Morant on Instagram Live. Next, I look down at pocket kings on the button. There's an under the gun straddle to 4 before the cutoff makes the call. I raise to 20, and both the straddle and the cutoff call. We go 3 ways to a flop that comes 5, 3, jack, rainbow. I'm gearing up for a sizable c-bet, but before I get the chance, the straddle actually leads out for 20 and the cutoff makes the call. There's no way we're going to see the turn at this price point. I raise to 85. The original bettor makes a surprising fold before the cutoff decides to ship it for 140 total. Not much of a decision here. I flick in the chips and table my hand. My opponent shows Jack-9 offsuit, very interesting. He's drawing super slim, and those slim hopes take a bit of a hit when the turn brings the king of clubs. So top set and a meaningless river, I end up taking another stack off this guy. Feels bad, but not that bad. Next, I've got queen 10 offsuit on the button. There's an early position raise to 10, followed by a call in the cutoff. Normally this hand is about as profitable as running a poker YouTube channel, but considering the bad beat jackpot qualifier, I decide to make the call in position. The big blind calls as well, and the four of us see a flop of 3-9-5 with 2 diamonds. Action checks to me, and I decide to check as well to see if I can realize some equity on the turn. It seems like a good choice as the turn brings the 8 of spades, giving me a gutter to the nuts straight. This time the big blind leads out for 10 before under the gun and the cutoff make the call. With 2 overs and a gutter, calling in position is definitely a good option, especially considering the price I'm getting. But I think there's a better choice. When under the gun and the cutoff both just flat the 10, their ranges are very capped, otherwise they would have raised on this wet texture. The same is true for the big blind, who only bet 10 into a pot of 40. A raise here is going to put tons of pressure on one pair type hands, not only from my raise, but from the fact that they have additional players to contend with. So even though my line is about as coherent as a Christopher Nolan screenplay, I decide to go for it and raise it up to 50. The big blind and cutoff fold while the under the gun player makes the call, so just one player left to contend with, heading to the river in position. The river brings the ace of spades and under the gun checks once more. Even though my opponent improves to top pair and sometimes 2 pair on this river, I think he also misses it a fair bit, so I jam all in for his remaining 100. No sweat here though, we get the snap fold and things are starting to really pick up. Soon after this, the floor informs me that I need to move to the main game from this feeder table. Normally I would be upset about that, but it looks like I'm going to run even better at this table when I look down at pocket aces in the big blind in the very first hand. There's a raise to 12 from early position, a call from the player next to act, before I decide to raise to 65. Only the original raiser makes the call, and we're going heads up to a flop that, you're not going to believe, it's ace-6, I flop quads. How is this happening? Now, I'm not entirely sure what to do here with quads. I guess we're probably supposed to slow play at some frequency, considering we block all the good hands. On the other hand, I think a check might set off more alarm bells than just a regular c-bet. With that in mind, I decide to go for a c-bet of 35. My opponent spends a few moments deliberating before making the call. The turn brings the 4 of clubs, and I elect to check here. I'm not sure medium pocket pairs like pocket 8s or pocket 9s are going to call another bet here, and I want to let unpaired hands that flow to the flop take a stab at it. No stabs this time, as my opponent checks it back and we see a queen of spades on the river. Definitely time for a value bet, the question is what size? I think players are going to be highly responsive to bet size on this river, so betting a big size like pot or even overbetting is probably going to generate an overfold. It's pretty hard for my opponent to have a value hand here anyways, but if he does have a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 9s, or maybe a random queen, I think he'll call something like a half pot bet or a 2/3 pot bet. So that's what I settle for, a bet of 125 into about 210. My opponent seems a bit perplexed by this bet and ends up spending about a minute of real time on this decision. Finally, he decides on a call. I flip what I imagine to be the best hand before my opponent reluctantly tables King Queen of Diamonds. Very surprised to see that hand, as that's basically one of the best hands he could have on this river, so if he's tanking with that hand, then he must be folding everything else. I'm not sure, but either way, I end up taking down another sizable pot. At this point in the session, I'm running so hot that my chip stack is actually interfering with my vlogging. So apologies for some of these angles. I hate when that happens. Later on, I'm in early position, and if you squint your eyes over this mountain of chips, you can see that I've been dealt pocket aces. There's one limper, so I open to 15 and get called by the cutoff and the original limper. So 3 ways and off to a flop that's a bit of a letdown. It's 7-9 ace, so only top set this time. I go ahead and c-bet for 35 and both players fold. Kinda shitty to be running so bad, but what are you gonna do? One orbit later, I look down at ace-king in early position and open to 16. The hijack and the button both call, so we go 3 ways to a flop that comes ace, 5, 8, rainbow. I'm probably mixing a bet and a check here at a fairly even ratio. I decide to bet this time, so I make it 30. The hijack calls and the button folds, so off to a turn now, heads up, which comes the 4 of diamonds. This card definitely favors my opponent, as he's going to have a lot more 4-6, 6-7, 5-6, hands that improve to either a straight, 2-pair, or a pair plus gutter. It's not really great to be inflating the pot versus those types of hands when we have a pretty deep SPR and I'm out of position. On the other hand, I do have top pair, top kicker, and I know I'll get called by worse. So could go either way here probably. I opt for a check this time. My opponent decides he doesn't want a free card and puts out a bet of 50. I could raise here, although I'm not sure exactly how many worse hands are going to make the call. In game, I decide to just flat. Off to the river, and shocker, it's a good one for me. It is the king of hearts. I decide to stay in flow and check it over to the hijack. He doesn't waste too much time before carving out a bet of 105. Really interesting spot here with top 2 pair. I'm sure the solver has us check raising here at very high frequency. Against this player pool though, I'm not sure how often we're going to get called by a worse hand. If my opponent is doing any sort of hand reading, it's going to be obvious that I have a hand like 2 pair or better when I check raise. Then again, people find all sorts of reasons to make speculative calls, even in spots where them having the best hand is about as likely as Tom DeWan making a river decision with his mouth closed. Ultimately, I'm just not confident enough in how I would want to size the raise or how often I would get called by worse, so I end up just calling. My opponent tables his hand first, and he shows ace-4 of spades for worse 2 pair. That's one of the few hands that may have called a small raise on the river, so a little bit disappointed to see that. Looking back, I'm really not sure on this hand. Maybe I should have led the river, maybe I should have check raised the river. I don't know, a few different options there. Let me know if you have any specific thoughts on this one. The next hand starts with a bunch of limps to me on the button when I look down at pocket 10s. I go ahead and raise it up to 16, probably should go a little bit bigger, as I get called by 4 players and we're going 5 ways to a flop that comes 4, 3, jack, rainbow. Action checks to me, and normally with pocket 10s I would play a pretty heavy check here, but I think with a small sizing there's a good chance we'll get called by worse hands like pocket 5s or ace 4, ace 5, etc., especially 5 ways, so I go ahead and size down to 26. The under the gun limper and the low jack both make the call, so we're going 3 ways to a turn that, look, we all know what this card is going to be. I don't need to say it. At this point, I don't even know what to say about this. Is Worm dealing? Did I turn into Mike McDermott somehow? Both players check, and I decide to put money in the pot. Under the gun folds, but the low jack decides to go all in for 260. I like money. I call. Off to the river, which is a little bit scary. It's the 9 of clubs. My opponent announces though that he just has a jack. I flip my hand and deliver the bad news. Obviously, I'm running insanely hot this session, but I do want to note I wouldn't be up nearly as much money if people hadn't been continually finding themselves with a second best hand. But I do think there's a difference between getting coolered with a second best hand and making questionable decisions that might cost you money. Speaking of questionable decisions, this hand starts when an early position player opens to 10, 2 players call, and I look down at ace-jack on the button. I might 3-bet this at some frequency, but the bad beat jackpot is still in effect, and I'm looking to keep everybody in, so I make the call. The 4 of us are off to a flop, and shockingly, I don't flop quads. In fact, it's kind of shit. It's 5-4-3 with 2 diamonds, so I've got a backdoor flush draw, 2 overs, and a bad gutter. The original raiser continues for 25, there's 1 fold, the low jack calls, and it's on me. I think there's a few viable options on this flop. Obviously folding is fine. Calling is cool because we get to play in position and realize our equity. We also sometimes can turn our hand into a bluff depending on the action and depending on the run out. But there is this secret third thing called raising. Just for a moment, think about the early position player's range. He's probably not bluffing a ton into 2 players on this board texture, so I'm guessing his range is primarily comprised of straights, sets, 2 pair, overpairs, and some draws. Overpairs are about 48 combos, sets, 2 pair and straights, about 20 combos, and then some unknown number of draws like 5-6 or diamonds that are dependent on how loose the player is when they open. And now we see the problem with having a continuation bet here. Most of his overpairs are going to be very uncomfortable facing a raise on this flop. The turn and river are going to be even more challenging as the nuts are going to constantly change and the pot is going to grow in size. His other hands like straights, sets, and draws are going to fare considerably better, but they still suffer from the main problem of playing out of position with a range disadvantage at a deep SPR. All this is my long-winded way of saying I don't think we should have any sort of bets on this board texture here. But that's a bunch of theory, let's get back to the hand. When he picks this sizing, I don't think he can have the top of range hands like sets or straights. The same is basically true for the low jack, as how could you ever just flat call with a strong hand like that multi-way on this board texture? So against two capped ranges in position, I decide to turn this hand into a bluff and raise to 85. Maybe I should go a little bit bigger here to represent these straights and sets that I'm basically saying I have, as I get called by the original bettor and the low jack. Whoops, forget all that stuff I was saying, maybe I was just talking out of my ass. But I'm not dead, I still can hit an ace, running diamonds, maybe a jack is good, who knows. Unfortunately, the turn does not bring any of those. In fact, it might be one of the worst cards. It's another 3 pairing the board and eliminating some of the sets I can have. Both players check to me, and I'm wondering if I should fire another barrel. Remember, we're still dealing with 2 capped ranges here that should basically never be straights and very rarely be a boat or quads. I decide to check it back here and gather more information on the river. I can still credibly represent boats and quads here, as those hands might check back at some frequency. I also can possibly represent a flush if the flush completer comes in, and I have the ace of diamonds to block the nut flush. So off to the river here, and not exactly sure what I'm rooting for. So when it falls the king of spades, I'm not really sure if that's helpful. The original raiser checks as expected before the low jack carves out a bet of 200. This is a weird as hell bet. If you watch my vlog regularly, you know one of my core beliefs is people at these stakes don't value bet the river thinly. And what type of value could he have? We've already eliminated most of the nut type hands like sets and straights, maybe some sort of king queen or king jack of diamonds type hand. But I also expect those hands to check fairly frequently, hoping to pick off one of my bluffs on the river. So really, this is almost always a bluff. The only concern I have is if he decided he needed to turn a hand like 5-6 or pocket 6s or pocket 7s into a bluff. While I can't beat those hands at showdown, I might be able to get them to fold. He only has about $200 left. I have all the good hands in my range, he has none of them. I don't know exactly what I'm doing. This could either be a brilliant decision or an Elon Musk running Twitter decision with no in between. I carve out 400 in chips and send it into the middle. Godspeed, my friends. I am immediately staring off into space. I don't want to give any sort of information away, so I even miss the early position player instantly folding his hand. Good news. I have to say, this might be the most nervous I've been at a poker table in years. It's not that it's a huge amount of money, but I am putting in 200 big blinds on the river when my opponent has already put in half his stack, and I'm relying on a very esoteric read. I mean, it is dicey. The minutes start to drag on, and on, and on. I think my opponent realizes this is not a spot people have a bluff in. Who clicks it back as a bluff here? And it's obvious he also has a garbage hand that shouldn't have bet the river. Finally, mercifully, this hand comes to a conclusion when my opponent... Fuck! Well, at least I tried, guys. It was good content. What are you gonna do? I do think my logic was sound, and I understand why I went for it, but... What? This is the part of the video where I'm supposed to say something intelligible about the strategy or about what happened, but I'm fucking dumbfounded. My opponent later mentioned something about being outkicked, so I'm guessing he had ace-6, maybe ace-7. In conclusion, what a wild hand. I don't know if my strategy made sense, I don't know if I played it well, maybe I just backed into a win somehow. Let me know what you think in the comments. Final accounting for this session, I was in for 300, out for 24.97 for a profit of 21.97. One of my best sessions on the year and probably my favorite session on the vlog so far. A few quick announcements about the channel. I was recently accepted into the YouTube Partner Program, which means I can now offer memberships. You should see a small join button below the video. It's essentially a $3 subscription that gives you a special badge next to your name and priority in the comments. It's basically a way to help support the channel if you like what I'm doing and want to help me grow, but all of my content will remain free on YouTube. I'm also gearing up to partner with Zapruder affiliates to offer up to 25% rakeback on sites like GG Poker, ACR, Ignition, etc. So if you're playing online on those sites and you don't have rakeback, check out the link in the description. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. Shout out to you if you made it all the way through. This has been my longest vlog by far, with the longest hand, that ace-jack hand. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see y'all in the next video.